Have you ever felt that no matter how hard you pray, your connection with God feels distant? Like there's a wall between you and His voice? Pause. I used to feel exactly the same way. And then I discovered something that changed everything, hidden in the writings of C.S. Lewis. You see, Lewis once wrote something profound about spiritual deafness. He said we often blame God for His silence, when in reality, we might be the ones wearing invisible earplugs. But slight laugh. That hit me hard. Because just like you, I spent years wondering why God felt so distant, why His guidance seemed so unclear. Finally, He responded to my question at a dinner party, suspending productivity, just to allow me to serve. But here's what fascinated me. Lewis didn't just point out the problem. He had uncovered specific patterns, habits that were actually blocking God's voice in our lives. And what he revealed was both disturbing and liberating. These weren't obvious sins or clear mistakes. No, these were subtle, everyday habits that most of us don't even realize we're doing. Habits that slowly, invisibly, build up those walls between us and God's guidance. Think about it. How many times have you felt stuck, unsure of God's direction for your life? How many sleepless nights have you spent wondering if you're making the right choices? If you're anything like me, probably more times than you can count. But what if I told you that the solution isn't about praying harder or being more religious? What if the key to hearing God's voice clearly was actually about unlearning certain behaviors? In this video, I'm going to share something that might completely transform your spiritual journey. We'll dive deep into C.S. Lewis's wisdom and uncover 6 toxic habits that might be blocking God's voice in your life right now. And trust me, number 4, hit me so hard it actually made me question everything I thought I knew about my relationship with God. But here's the thing. I can't just list these habits without proper context, because understanding why these habits are so dangerous and how they sneakily creep into our lives is just as important as identifying them. So stick with me until the end, because what I'm about to share isn't just information, it's transformation. And by the time we're done, you'll have a clear roadmap to reconnecting with God's voice in your life. And if you're wondering whether this will actually work for you, well, let me tell you a story that might sound familiar. It was a typical Sunday morning when Sarah, one of my closest friends, broke down in tears after the service. "I've been praying for guidance about my career for months," she said, "but it feels like I'm talking to a wall." Her story isn't unique. I've heard similar pain from countless others. Maybe even you've felt it too. That moment with Sarah was when I first started connecting the dots between what C.S. Lewis wrote and the struggles we face today. You see, Lewis understood something profound about our modern spiritual crisis. In his book, The Screwtape Letters, he describes how the enemy doesn't need to make us disbelieve in God. He just needs to make us deaf to His voice. And in our hyper-connected, constantly distracted world, that deafness has reached epidemic proportions. Think about it. When was the last time you sat in complete silence, without your phone, without Netflix, without any distractions? If you're like most people, you probably can't remember. And that's exactly where our problem begins. But remember that 4th habit I mentioned earlier? We're getting closer to understanding why it's so devastating to our spiritual life. Now, let me share something fascinating from history. During World War II, Lewis noticed how people struggled to hear God's voice during times of crisis. But here's the surprising part. It wasn't the chaos of war that blocked their connection with God. It was something much more subtle. Something that's even more prevalent in our lives today. You might be thinking, okay, but what does this have to do with me? Well, imagine you're trying to hear a whisper in a room full of loudspeakers. That's essentially what we're doing every day, surrounding ourselves with so much noise that God's voice gets drowned out. But it's not just external noise we're talking about here. These toxic habits I'm going to reveal, they're like invisible barriers, each one adding another layer of static to our spiritual reception. And just like Sarah, many of us are desperately seeking guidance, while unknowingly reinforcing these barriers every single day. Material wealth, such as wealth representing some form of billionaire status in the world. Billions of people around the globe are invited to MMA. Let me give you another example. Last month I met a successful businessman at a conference. Let's call him Mike. He had everything society tells us we should want: money, status, a perfect family. But he confided in me that despite his daily prayers and regular church attendance, he felt spiritually numb. What he discovered through Lewis's wisdom completely transformed his approach to faith. And it all started with recognizing these toxic habits we're about to discuss. But here's what makes this journey so crucial. These habits don't just affect our ability to hear God. They reshape our entire spiritual identity, much like how a river slowly carves through rock. The transformation is so gradual that we don't notice it until we find ourselves in a spiritual desert, wondering how we got there. C.S. Lewis had an incredible way of illuminating these subtle spiritual dangers. In Mere Christianity, he writes about how the enemy's most effective strategy isn't to push us away from God dramatically, but to slowly guide us into patterns that dull our spiritual senses. And that fourth habit I keep mentioning? It's perhaps the most cunning example of this strategy. Perret has written the foreword for the book, and it's perhaps the most cunning example of this strategy. As we go deeper into these toxic habits, you'll start recognizing patterns in your own life. You might even feel uncomfortable. I know I did when I first encountered these truths. But remember, awareness is the first step toward transformation. And trust me, when we get to that fourth habit, you'll understand why this message couldn't wait. Now, before we dive into these specific habits, there's something crucial you need to understand about how they operate in our lives. It's like a spiritual version of the frog in boiling water analogy. These habits don't suddenly appear. They creep in so gradually that we don't realize their impact until it's too late. Let me share something fascinating that Lewis wrote in a letter to his friend Arthur Greeves in 1930. He described what he called spiritual interference, the moments when we think we're drawing closer to God, but we're actually creating more distance. And this brings us to a crucial realization about these toxic habits. They often masquerade as virtues. Virtues find deep roots and must be planted, not just letting go, but vigilantly maintained. You know that feeling when you're trying to tune an old radio and you're almost there, but there's still static? That's exactly what these habits do to our spiritual reception. And here's where it gets really interesting. The static isn't coming from where you might expect. Remember Mike, the businessman I mentioned? Well, there's more to his story. He was doing everything right, leading Bible studies, tithing generously, serving on church committees. But these activities were actually masking something deeper, something that relates directly to that fourth habit we're building up to. Now let me take you back to something Lewis observed during his time at Oxford. He noticed a pattern among the most religious students. They often struggled the most with hearing God's voice clearly. It wasn't because they weren't devoted enough. It was because they had unknowingly adopted certain habits that created spiritual interference. It was not long before religious life became a blur for them, and all they really wanted to do was to be created spiritual interference. Step away from the inner workings. Think about this for a moment. Have you ever noticed how some of the most spiritual activities in your life can sometimes leave you feeling more disconnected from God? There's a reason for that, and it's directly connected to these habits we're about to uncover. But before we get there, I need to share something that might surprise you. These toxic habits, they're not new. They've been around since biblical times. Remember the Pharisees? They were experts at appearing spiritual while being spiritually deaf. And in our modern world, we've just gotten better at disguising these habits. Here's a thought that might shake you up a bit. What if some of your most treasured spiritual practices are actually contributing to the static? What if, like that fourth habit we're building up to, they're actually creating more distance between you and God's voice? I remember sitting in my study late one night poring over Lewis's works when I stumbled upon a passage that made me close the book and just sit in silence. It was about how we often mistake spiritual busyness for spiritual connection. And that's when the pieces started falling into place. You can't spiritualize the world and not spiritualize the soul. And that's when the pieces started falling into place. You see, these toxic habits aren't just behaviors. They're patterns of thinking that have become so normalized in our Christian culture that we hardly question them. They're like spiritual blind spots. And just like driving a car, blind spots can be dangerous if we're not aware of them. Let me give you an example that might hit close to home. Sarah, my friend from earlier, she discovered that one of these habits had been affecting her for years, disguised as something positive. And when she finally identified it, well, let's just say it explains why that fourth habit is so crucial to understand. But here's what makes this journey so important. These habits don't just affect our individual relationship with God. They ripple out into every area of our lives, influencing our decisions, relationships, and even our understanding of faith itself. As we get closer to revealing these habits, I want you to prepare yourself for something uncomfortable. Because, just like Lewis wasn't afraid to challenge the comfortable Christianity of his day, we need to be willing to examine our own spiritual practices with honest eyes. And trust me, when we get to that fourth habit, well, let's just say it might explain why you've been feeling that spiritual static for so long. But before we get there, there's one more crucial piece of the puzzle we need to understand. Now let me finally reveal what C.S. Lewis understood about these toxic habits that block God's voice. And yes, we're finally going to talk about that fourth habit that I've been hinting at. But first, let's understand the first three, because they set the stage for the shocking revelation that follows. Slowness. The first toxic habit is what Lewis called spiritual noise. It's not just about external distractions, it's about filling our spiritual life with so much religious activity that we can't hear God's whisper. Think about Martha in the Bible, so busy serving that she missed sitting at Jesus' feet. We do the same thing today with endless Bible apps, devotional podcasts, and Christian social media. The second habit is what Lewis termed calculated devotion. This is when we turn our relationship with God into a transaction. If I pray for an hour, God must answer. If I fast twice a week, He has to speak to me. Sound familiar? This habit turns God from a father into a vending machine, and it's killing our ability to hear His voice. The third habit is comfortable conformity. This is when we surround ourselves only with voices that confirm what we already believe. Lewis warned about this in The Weight of Glory, describing how we can create an echo chamber that drowns out God's challenging, transformative voice. And now, that fourth habit, the one that shocked me to my core when I first understood it. Lewis called it spiritual self-deception, but it's more than that. It's the habit of using God's voice to validate our own desires. Pause. Let that sink in for a moment. You see, this fourth habit is particularly dangerous because it feels so right. We pray about something, and suddenly everything seems to confirm what we already wanted to do. Every song on the radio, every Bible verse we read, every sermon we hear, they all seem to point to our predetermined conclusion. But here's the devastating truth. We're not hearing God's voice. We're hearing our own echo. I remember when I first realized I was doing this. I was praying about a major life decision, but in reality, I was just looking for divine permission to do what I had already decided. Sound familiar? This habit is so ingrained in our modern Christian culture that we hardly notice it anymore. The fifth habit builds on this, what Lewis called selective listening. We tune into God's voice only when we expect Him to say what we want to hear. It's like having a phone conversation, but hanging up every time the other person starts saying something challenging. Bullet. And the sixth habit. Well, this one ties everything together. It's what Lewis described as spiritual impatience. We've become so accustomed to instant gratification that we can't wait for God's timing. We mistake His silence for absence, His patience for indifference. This indifference is patience for indifference, the secret of spiritual impatience, and the secret of soul patience. But here's where it gets really interesting. These habits don't work in isolation. They form a web, each one reinforcing the others. And that fourth habit, spiritual self-deception, acts as the linchpin holding them all together. It's like a spiritual blind spot that makes all the other habits possible. Now remember Mike, the businessman? When he finally understood these habits, particularly that fourth one, everything changed. He realized he'd been using hearing God's voice as a way to spiritually justify decisions he'd already made. The transformation in his life, once he addressed these habits, was nothing short of remarkable. External testimony. Now, remember Mike the businessman once again, when he finally understood these habits. And Sarah? She discovered that her struggle with hearing God's voice wasn't because God wasn't speaking. It was because these habits had created so much internal noise that she couldn't hear Him. The solution wasn't more spiritual activities. It was learning to recognize and break free from these toxic patterns. "I need you," Sarah said. She closed her eyes and began to breathe. But here's the most important part. Understanding these habits is only half the battle. The real transformation comes from what we're about to discuss next. So, how do we break free from these toxic habits and truly hear God's voice? The answer lies in what C.S. Lewis called the art of spiritual listening. It's not about adding more spiritual practices. It's about stripping away the layers of noise we've built up. Start with silence, real silence. Not the kind where you're thinking about your to-do list or planning your next prayer, but the kind where you simply exist in God's presence. Lewis wrote that God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. Sometimes, we need to stop talking to start hearing. For that fourth habit, spiritual self-deception, the antidote is brutal honesty with yourself. Before claiming, "God told me," ask yourself, am I really seeking His voice, or am I seeking validation? The answer might surprise you, and that's exactly where transformation begins. Remember Mike? He started spending the first 15 minutes of his day in complete silence. No Bible reading, no prayer requests, just silence. And Sarah? She began journaling her thoughts before praying, separating her desires from God's guidance. Both discovered that God had been speaking all along. They just hadn't been truly listening. You 10 to 15 customary routines. Here's the beautiful truth. God wants to speak to you more than you want to hear Him. These toxic habits aren't chains you're stuck with. They're patterns you can change. And when you do, when you finally clear away the static, his voice becomes clearer than ever. She nodded, turning her face away from the window. I've seen this transformation in my own life, in Mike's life, in Sarah's life, and I believe it can happen in yours too. Because hearing God's voice isn't about being more spiritual. It's about being more real. It's about dropping the religious pretense and entering into an authentic relationship with a father who never stops speaking to his children. Start today. Pick one habit, maybe that fourth one that resonated with you, and begin the journey of transformation. Take time for real silence. Practice brutal honesty in your prayers. Wait expectantly but patiently. And most importantly, remember that God's voice often comes not in the earthquake or fire, but in the gentle whisper. If this message has touched something deep within you, if you've recognized these habits in your own life and you're ready for change, then you're exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe and join our community of seekers who are learning to hear God's voice more clearly every day. Share this video with someone who needs this message, because sometimes the greatest act of love is helping others clear away the static that's blocking God's voice in their lives. Expository note, not much. This isn't just about subscribing to a channel. It's about embarking on a journey of genuine spiritual transformation. And I'll be here sharing more insights from C.S. Lewis and others who've walked this path before us, helping you rediscover the clarity of God's voice in your life.